Okay, welcome back to episode 5 of the NVT EASY Rider recommissioning. And in episode 4, we did an inspection of the spare engine, which is the original engine for this bike, which looked a bit like this. And that spare engine now looks like this. Let's take a closer look. I will apologise if you're expecting me to be showing you how to disassemble this engine. I'm not, because it took me all of 30 minutes, because it was already partially disassembled anyway. There was no flywheel stator fitted. And if I had filmed it in YouTube time, it's about 2.5 hours. And it's currently -3 out here in the workshop, and I'm not going to spend that amount of time out in the cold doing it. If in any doubt, consult the Haynes manual. There's a very good Haynes manual for the NVT EASY Rider, and it shows you the complete disassembly of both the single speed and the 2-speed models. This is the 2-speed. So what we've got here, these are the center cases. You've got the crankshaft here, and various little containers of all the pinions and nuts and washers and shims and clutch assembly. I will give you some hints and tips though. When you take it apart, what I do is I cable tie all the kinds of various assemblies together, because there's lots of shims and these need to go in the right place, because if you don't, it kind of upsets where all the kind of end play is on various parts that are assembled on the shafts and things, and these are set at the factory, so it's important that they go back in the right order, because sometimes no two engines are the same. Tomos engines are like that. You change the crankshaft on one of them, sometimes they need more shims, sometimes they need less shims. I've done the same thing here, this kind of intermediate shaft. This has got the ratchet on it. Again, this thing will just pop apart because the spring's inside there. And the same thing with the centrifugal clutch assembly. All right, the next thing you need to pay attention to is the orientation of these crankshaft oil seals. There's one in each casing, and they always face out. So if you remember in part 4, I removed this one from there to reveal that the bearing had failed. Now, if they were positioned that way round, so that flat face was up against the bearing, it would essentially bridge the rotating part of the bearing, there, the inner part, and the fixed part, the outer part, causing the bearing seal to fail quite quickly because of the friction of the two parts rubbing against each other. Whereas you've got a gap there and a gap there, and it stops that, it limits that amount of friction between the two parts. Also, if you put them in that way around, it creates like a little void behind it where the lubricating oil that's suspended in the fuel mixture can get in behind the back of the bearing and lubricate the whole bearing race. If you were to put them in that way around, you've got very little void. There's very little space in there for the oil to get in and lubricate the bearing. Something you might have noticed is the crank bearings actually stay in the crankcase halves. They don't come out on the crankshaft. And this is because it's a vertically split engine case. And so when you separate the cases, the actual crankshaft actually comes out with very little effort. You only have to tap the end of it with a rubber mallet. That's because it's a transition fit here and here between the inner race of the crank bearing, whereas the outer side of the bearing is actually an interference fit with the case. So to get these out, you've got to warm the cases up, and to get them back in again, you've got to kind of freeze the bearings, warm the cases, and then just tap the bearings back in with a suitably sized socket and a rubber mallet. If you were to try and push the bearings onto the crank first and then try and get them into the case, what you could find is that they don't go in squarely, like a crack the bearing pocket. And if you did manage to get them in and then put the other half on, you might find that the cases don't actually close up if the bearings haven't been put on fully onto the crankshaft. If you were to try and force them on using the actual retaining bolts, chances are you could actually crack the casing as well. If you've got a horizontally split engine, splits like that, like a Puch Maxi, then yes, the bearings do go onto the crankshaft first. That's because in the lower half of the crankcase, there's a bearing pocket each side the bearings sit in. And then on the top half of the crankcase, there's a corresponding kind of mirror image of that. That kind of goes over the top of the bearing, and that's what keeps the crankshaft aligned. So this here is the kind of pedal crank and output shaft assembly. This has actually got tape on it. This is what the front sprocket actually fits onto. I needed a 3-legged puller to pull that sprocket off because it's a taper fit. It's actually quite tight. Also, that nut on there, I think it was a 90mm socket. Does help if you've got an impact gun to take that off, especially if the engine's out of the frame, because you've got no way of stopping it from rotating. If the engine's in the frame, you can kind of lock the sprocket with the drive chain and put the back brake on. As a matter of fact, I actually used my trusty Parkside impact drive on all the tight shaft retaining nuts on this engine with a square drive adapter and some impact bits, because it made it a lot easier. On the crank shaft clutch assembly, there is actually, if I can find it, there is actually a large kind of nut cast onto this. You can use a large spanner or kind of grips to stop the shaft from rotating, and just use a normal spanner or socket set on it. But all the other ones I use the impact on, which shows they're not just for woodworking. So the next step for me is to order up the bearings, make sure the seals that came with the engine fit, because these are different to the crank seals that were fitted at the factory, and I'll start the reassemble of the engine. So thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing. Please do so if you haven't done so, because it does help boost the channel. And let me know if you like the video by clicking that little thumbs up button down there. Thanks for watching.